So in Brunswick, what do you think? What is the most dangerous aspect of climate change to Brunswick? We've talked about a lot of different aspects of climate change. We've talked about temperature increases, droughts, more frequent hurricanes, loss of biodiversity, sea level rise, all these components of climate change. I'm curious, what do you think is the most dangerous aspect of climate change in Brunswick? Well, I would argue that the answer to that question is sea level rise. All right, so that's what we're going to focus on here. Sea level rise, I argue, is the most dangerous to Brunswick because we are an extremely low elevation area. We do deal with frequent storms, and the frequency and intensity of hurricanes, not storms necessarily, but hurricanes, is going to increase. And because of that, we're going to have to deal with storm surge on top of sea level rise. And I think that is going to be the most pressing issue moving forward as the climate continues to change. So in class, we will use the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer to investigate this further. But just know that when we're thinking about how hurricanes are interacting with sea level rise, that we have to consider the storm surge, right? So a typical tropical storm can have storm surges up to 3 or so feet. But if a Category 5 hurricane were to ever hit us, the storm surge could be 20 to 24 feet above the mean sea level. So this NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer that only shows sea level, if you're curious what would happen if a Category 5 or some other category hurricane hit us, add that storm surge onto the sea level that is shown on the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer. But I encourage you, go ahead and play around with that before you come to class, because it's a fascinating tool. You can learn a lot there. Another tool that you can use is flood factor. Flood factor is part of the overall group called risk factor, and it goes to cities around the US and quantifies how at risk they are for certain events and how that's going to change in the future due to climate change. So we're going to talk about flood risk here, but if you want to go to this website, it also talks about fire risk, heat wave risk, things like that. So here in Brunswick, there are about 6,500 properties that have a greater than 26% chance of being severely affected by flooding over the next 30 years. Now, to put these numbers into perspective, I want you to think about your own personal decision-making, right? If you were going to buy property, or if you were going to invest in a local school, if you were going to build a park, right? However you're going to impact with your community, if you were to invest in a property and you were told that there's a quarter chance, 25% chance, that property will be severely affected by flooding within the next 30 years, would you purchase that property or invest in that property? For me personally, that answer is no. That's too big of a risk for me. So that is what our community is facing, right? It's not 100% chance, right? Actually, if we think about probabilities, it probably won't happen. But a quarter of a chance is still a lot, and a quarter of a chance can influence the way, or should influence the way, we are investing in our community. This map is showing areas and how intensely they are likely to be impacted by flooding, where dark red is extremely at risk, all the way up to light yellow being at minor risk. So you can see what the areas are that are most at risk. The areas downtown that are very low elevation, they're already flooded during an extreme high tide. They're high at risk. A lot of places in St. Simons, definitely those places along the coast, along the marsh, those places are at high risk. I hear people all the time when I tell them, like, oh, I would never buy property on a barrier island. They tell me, oh, but St. Simon's fine because we very rarely get hurricanes, and there's a lot of high elevation places in St. Simon's. And yes, even though there might be relatively high elevation places in St. Simon's, it's still a barrier island. It's still the very first part of the land that's going to be impacted by a hurricane. So if you imagine a storm surge of 5, 10, 20 feet being added to the sea level rise, I argue that St. Simon's is not a safe place to invest. There are some safe places to invest, right? If you go up near the airport, there are many properties off of exit 29, right? But those places more inland are a safe place. So again, I'm coming back to not just sea level rise, but thinking about how the storms will interact with that. Because if we are, projecting forward 30, 40, 50 years, it doesn't matter what just like the regular everyday sea level is doing. It matters what the sea level is doing in addition to or when those hurricanes that don't happen very often, but do happen, those hurricanes hit. So in order to know how frequently those hurricanes hit, we can look back. These are all of the hurricanes that have hit the Georgia coast on record, dating all the way back to the 1850s. And you can see that we rarely have hurricanes. Most of the hurricanes that do hit us are category 1, category 2, right? Those that don't have a huge storm surge, it's less than 10 feet. But hurricane 3 and 4, category 3 and 4 hurricanes have hit us before. So they're rare, but they have hit our coast before, most recently in 1898. Now recall that as a result of climate change, the number of cyclones is expected to remain the same, maybe even decrease. Cyclones are just those cyclonic storm systems. But hurricanes, which are the strongest cyclones, they are expected to become more frequent. So overall number of storms isn't going to change. We don't expect. But the frequency of the most intense ones, so the frequency of hurricanes, we do think is going to increase and become more destructive. So just because our coast hasn't had a ton of hurricanes in the past does not mean that we can continue to think like that moving into decades in the future.